Live from Washington, D.C., this is a Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. Fight for freedom.
There is the physical fight against terror groups, one some argue we're losing.
I have no doubt ISIS is winning. We are neither degrading nor destroying ISIS.
And then there's the fight for our freedom, having to defend speech, display, religion.
Humanity's been grappling with these questions throughout human history.
At what point do the harrowing executions or attacks on the media become too much to bear? Do we censor ourselves out of safety or defiantly put pens in the air?
We cannot afford to be buffeted by alarmism and a nearly instantaneous news cycle.
There have been concessions from otherwise edgy publications blurring out controversial cartoons to Allied forces no longer flying fighter jets. In Paris, movie makers can no longer shoot action scenes over worries they'll confuse and cause panic. And here at home, the very opposite, as Fox News decides to show the burning of a Jordanian pilot to further demonstrate the enemy's brutality. In this battle, in the worries over war, there is no clear answer.
Joining our panel of experts tonight, Frank Gaffney, President and founder of the Center for Security Policy. Dr. Faheem Younus, President of the Muslim Men's Association. Director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, Clifford May. Jane Hall, Associate Professor of Journalism at American University. And Republican Congressman from Pennsylvania, Scott Perry.
Has our freedom of speech, the press, and expression stopped in the wake of recent terrorist acts? Good evening, I'm Jeff Barn, and welcome to our town hall meeting tonight. We'd like to thank our panel for being here tonight for this very important conversation. We'd also like to welcome our studio audience who will be asking questions throughout the night. And you can join the conversation at home simply by going to social media using the hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture. Your questions can be answered by members of our esteemed panel. Now, we get our coverage underway tonight with Chief Political Reporter Scott Thuman. He'll be monitoring this conversation throughout the next hour on social media this evening and joins us now from the newsroom with the latest updates in the fight for freedom. Scott.
Yeah, Jeff, so before we get too deep into the conversation, we do want to update you on what's been a very active 24 hours in the war on terror. First and primarily, President Obama meeting today with an important ally in this fight, Germany's Angela Merkel. The two were at the White House, held a joint press conference during the afternoon in which they discussed some of the measures they can take. Of course, Germany, one of many, by some counts, around 60 nations, now playing at least some role in the U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. President Obama today making sure he publicly affirms that relationship once again.
With regard to ISIL, Germany and the United States remain united in our determination to destroy this barbaric organization.
Fear is still very much a factor, and we are seeing that today in Tokyo. Listen to this. Japanese authorities just taking away the passport from a Japanese journalist who had planned to travel to and report from Syria after watching one of their own executed by ISIL last month. They have now decided to take the step to make sure that they prevent other journalists from going to that war zone, saying it is the government's responsibility to protect its citizens. That is just spurring the debate as far as what freedom some people say are now being curbed by this war on terror. Of course, we do want to hear from you throughout the night, so Jeff, I'll toss it back to you, but everyone who is watching tonight, we want you to hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture, and we will use it throughout the show. Back to you.
All right, Scott, good job. We'll talk to you in a few more minutes. Now, as Scott just said, Japan stopped these journalists from getting to Syria to cover the story. So how can the story get covered regarding one of the biggest stories in the forefront, ISIL, without them being able to go over there for fear of dying? I'm just going to throw this out to the panel. Whoever wants to chime in, go right ahead.
Well, you know, as a journalism professor here, that's very disheartening. The Committee to Protect Journalists has been keeping score on the number of journalists who have been murdered, and it is up significantly. International journalists, we have the beheadings of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, and we've had a lot of local journalists with the rise of repressive regimes. So to prevent a journalist from going seems highly peremptory and fairly alarming to me, although I can understand. I mean, journalists no longer have a press pass and a safety zone.
Here's the danger that I think is going to happen. If you can't have as many journalists going over there covering a critical story like this, how can you depend on accuracy, especially when Americans and the Western world wants to know about accuracy regarding a very ultra-conservative extremist jihad group?
I would say increasingly you cannot. And I say this as a former foreign correspondent for the New York Times and other papers. There are increasing swaths of the world where, first of all, it is dangerous, but it is also challenging to get anything other than color. You can't actually get information. Imagine trying to go to Syria and find out, well, are there moderate groups here who in fact should be supported because they are effective? You can't do that. Anybody who knows how you go into these countries nowadays is very different from when I was a journalist in some place like Northern Ireland. And everybody wanted to talk to me. I was a neutral. They wanted to tell me their story, so I would tell their story. Now they want to cut your head off and put it on videotape because that's how they tell their story best. So journalism is ineffective in more and more places. Now there may be some correctives for this, such as using the internet, such as being able to monitor the websites of these various groups so that you can find out in a place like, for example, Sinai. We had a researcher in my organization. He knew a lot about what was going on in the Sinai, but he never went there and wouldn't go there. It was too dangerous to go there. But journalism has become much more complicated now in terms of where you can go safely and where you can gather facts accurately, even if you get there.
Dr. Younus, this has got to concern you simply because you're trying to bridge the gap between the Muslim and the rest of the world spiritually.
And as members of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, we strongly believe that the key to this whole process is justice, and that's probably where I'm going to be during this panel today. So might as well, here's my first pushback. Somebody also have to ask the question, how was the story from Gaza reported when over a dozen journalists were killed over there and journalists are not allowed in Gaza? So we also have to talk on both sides of the story. This uproar in the American media when something happened in a Muslim country, which is atrocious, we absolutely denounce that. But I think the question that Ahmadiyya Muslim community will continue to ask, where is the justice? Where is that middle ground?
But in addition, there is this other thing operating clearly. It's not just the physical threats. It's not just the intimidation. You have a doctrine that is known as Sharia blasphemy law. These are intended to prevent speech that is deemed to be offensive to Muslims, and that can apply. And I think what your lead introduction piece indicated is it is applying here in the United States, not just in terms of what's happening or not happening with foreign correspondents trying to report from the scene.
All right, we're joined by Congressman Scott Perry from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania via satellite. Congressman, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can, and it seems to me, I've been listening to the discussion, it's fascinating that we're happy to impugn foreign governments, we're happy to impugn the vocation of journalism, but we seem to be missing the bigger point. There's a reason that they're not going. There's a reason that their governments don't want them to go. They don't want to be held ransom for a couple $100 million and then see one of their citizens murdered on national television and used as propaganda to show the weakness of the country or to portray something like that or suppose that, etc. The focus really should be on the reason why journalists don't feel safe to go with a press pass and report. Where time immemorial, while we had journalists, World War II, World War I, etc., there was a certain freedom granted to journalists. It was understood that they were reporting. That is no longer the case, and so I think we need to really understand and kind of get our brains wrapped around the nature of this enemy and how they operate, and that all those rules that we used to deal with before, that's all changed now.
Now, Congressman, you served time in the U.S. military, so in your opinion, sir, this so-called JV team that we've been hearing about for months now, can we ever defeat ISIS, in your particular opinion, militarily, psychologically, spiritually? How do we go about it?
Well, as a military tactician, as a strategist, I think that they can be defeated. But the first thing is to understand this is ideology. This is not an enemy that knows a country's borders. It's not a country waging war against some other country or the rest of the world. This is an ideology that exists not only in those countries, certainly it's more prevalent there, but it really literally exists in every single country. We must identify it and then use all the instruments of power. So it includes not only the military, not only psychologically, financial, diplomatic. When you go to war against someone, you take your whole country to war and all the instruments of war. In this case, these Sharia-inclined jihadists are at war with the West, and some countries in particular, namely America and other ones. We must use the instruments of power. We must recognize, understand, identify the enemy, and then use everything we can at our disposal to defeat them. And right now, we're barely using any of that.
All right, I would like to ask my next question, Dr. Younus. We talked about Sharia law just before coming on the air. How do you feel about it, being a Muslim, and how can you explain it to people who really need to understand what Sharia law is all about?
I think it's a misnomer. Saying that for asking a Muslim to denounce Sharia or Sharia law is like asking a Christian to denounce Bible. It's an all-encompassing word. What we should actually be talking about is the specifics. I would ask the Muslim community to denounce blasphemy laws because they are not mentioned in Holy Quran. I would ask them to denounce apostasy laws because anybody should be able to choose whatever they like. I would ask them to denounce the use of force to convert people. I would ask them to say, stand up for the country, for the loyalty of the country where you live. Those are the issues. When you ask Sharia law, why I'm saying this, because we alienate the 90% swing vote of Muslims in the middle who want to be good Muslims. When I try to serve my mother, I'm practicing Sharia. When I'm stopping at a stop sign, I'm practicing Sharia. When I say hello right now, give me a hand. All right, that was Sharia.
But at the same doctor, when you practice Sharia, aren't it? You know, when they mutilate the genitals of young women, that's practicing Sharia.
No, sir. No. I must push back on that. You're totally wrong.
That's all Sharia.
With all due respect, you're totally wrong. FGM, female genital mutilation, is an African ancient practice. Has nothing to do with Islam. And this is exactly the kind of rhetoric that is going to alienate American Muslims, that is alienating European Muslims when we try to link practices which are tribal to a faith.
Listen, I think what you're hearing from devout Muslims, to be sure, but a man who is widely considered to be an apostate by most of the people of his faith, is a selective rendering of what Sharia is. There's no question about it that it has elements of pietistic practice that Muslims around the world embrace and engage in. Unfortunately, the bulk of it is about power. It is about politics. It is about who is going to be dominant and in control. And there are elements of it that have heinous aspects, and indeed under some practices around the world, female genital mutilation is considered to be a component of Sharia. I just want to make clear that what I think the Congressman said is absolutely right. We're at war with this jihadist movement that embraces what they call Sharia, and we have to recognize it's not just this component of it, the Islamic State or however you wish to describe it.
But see, let me answer that, because again, my point is, it's 3 clicks away. We live in the age of Google. You can just go and Google FGM and you'll find out the facts. It is not Islamic. The larger question is
it more geographic than Islamic?
Geographic, cultural, tribal.
Northern Africa. Because the
same
thing
it's happening here. Just like in India.
It's happening here. Same thing about women being property. Same thing?
In India, they do gendercide. 11 million female fetuses were aborted in India. I would not link that to Hinduism. That would be atrocious. My point really is, you have to select, are you more afraid of the radicals and extremists, or are you more afraid of moderates and peaceful Muslims like me? Because if you're not, let me finish my point, which is, we are the only largely global world organization today, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Our Khalifa Mirza Masroor Ahmad, who came to the U.S. Congress here, has denounced, has clearly said there should be separation of church and state. We need to empower and embolden. You know, we need to give more airtime to such messages.
I agree with that, but
as compared to marginalizing them by saying that these are not marginal groups.
No.
You know, when you try to marginalize me, then the question is, are you really more scared of the extremists, or are you more scared of the reformists?
Let's get back to that in a second. We have a question from one of our audience members. Hello.
Hi, my name's Kristen Shremsky. I just moved to D.C. from Chicago. I have a quick question. I converted to Islam in July of 2001, right before September 11th, and I'd like to tell Mr. Gaffney that if female genital mutilation was part of this faith, obviously I wouldn't have converted. But I do want to ask the organizers of this town hall meeting, I came here hoping to have a great discussion, but a study by Berkeley and the Center for American Progress has identified Mr. Gaffney as one of the major funders of Islamophobia in this country. And how can we have a good discussion and an honest discussion when you have somebody on the panel who actually has an interest and sinks millions of dollars into funding Islamophobia?
Well,
and I'm serious about this question. I'd like to hear.
If I had millions of dollars, this would be a different deal. Let me be honest.
Okay.
I'm trying to make clear one point, and that is if we focus on facts and not on name-calling, which this lady has just engaged in, as do most of those who use this appellation, we're not going to be driven down a dead end. If we, in fact, can focus on what we're all, I think, up here at least, concerned about, which are practices that are heinous, as you said earlier, are anti-constitutional, are tremendously detrimental to freedom of not just speech, but of people like us and those who aspire to it elsewhere around the world. That's what we have to be focused on. And the name-calling and the allegations are nonsense, and I think, frankly, beneath this group.
May I just say something?
Before I go any further, I want to make this announcement. We did invite CARE here, the Council of American Islamic Relations. They wanted to be here, and in the last minute they chose not to be here. So when you say that we don't have everybody on the panel, we were supposed to have them. However, in the 11th hour, they did not show. Do you have a follow-up question?
I just wanted to say, yeah, I agree that we shouldn't have name-calling. I was just citing two credible studies.
Not credible.
But you have Muslims here telling you that these things are not part of Sharia, and you sit there to insist that they are. And this is not acceptable. We have people here who practice this faith devoutly. We can tell you what Sharia is and what Sharia isn't.
Actually, but can you admit that some people can practice religion, just like any other religion, a little bit more ultra-conservative and extreme, just like Islam, like Christianity, Judaism,
yeah, of course,
Shintoism?
ISIS is not practicing the Muslim religion. We hate ISIS. ISIS, as an American, I don't like what ISIS is doing. I hate them, and as a Muslim, I hate them because they're making our lives in this country unbearable.
Sure, and it seems to be more political than religious in every shape of the world.
And the problem that I have with media coverage is that reporting on ISIS is not within the whole geopolitical context of that region of the world. There are other things in there, and the media constantly likes to frame it as Islamic extremism, like even your promotional things talk about the radicalization of Islam. Islam is not being radicalized.
You know what? I'm going to have to wrap you up. I want to take you back to Scott Thuman, who is at our media center. Scott, what do you have for us?
Well, Jeff, the conversation upstairs, a lively one certainly, but despite the denunciations that we have seen over and over from particular groups or confusion over the definition of Sharia law, nonetheless, we are still seeing a considerable draw of people who have decided to join the fight overseas, foreign fighters as they're often called. In fact, over the weekend, we saw court appearances by one of 6 Bosnian immigrants who were arrested and rounded up, accused of funneling money and supplies to the fight in Syria. In fact, one of them, a mother of 4, was arrested. And then, of course, furthering that argument, we had someone recently from Minnesota, a 19-year-old, who today had a court appearance, was joining 3 other people, went to New York, trying to join the fight overseas. So the implication, regardless of definition, that this fight continues over who is willing to join the fight, that's going to continue. And I want to show you briefly here, as we talk social media, on Twitter. This is from Twitter, and what it shows is how many times a nation, in this case the United States, has actually requested from Twitter account information from someone. 1,622 times the United States has asked Twitter for help in determining where someone's tweeting from, what their account information is. In not all cases terrorism related, but sometimes. The next closest, 327 accounts, and that coming out of Turkey. So we talk about social media being an impetus in all of this, and the idea of trying to track down what they consider to be threats, and the U.S. #1 across the world in trying to figure out who's tweeting what. Jeff?
That is amazing. All right, Scott, thanks. As always, we'll refer back to you in a few more minutes. Now, we have received questions from you, the viewers, nationwide, and here's what one of you had to say.
Hi, my name is Erin, and I'm a junior at Seattle University. And today I want to ask a question about the selectivity in the freedom of speech in the U.S. So if this entire attack the one that took place in Paris, if it had happened with the context of maybe a Jewish cartoon or a Christian cartoon, would the response have been different, and is this differing response hypocritical?
Very good question from Aaron. I'm going to throw that to the panel. It is a really good question because, yes, this did happen in Paris with a satirical magazine, but at the same token, is it, in your opinion, let's start with you, Jane, is it in your opinion to sell magazines to have that shock value that a lot of publications have, or is it something much, much deeper?
Well, you know, I understand from talking to people who are Muslim that this is deeply offensive, and I think that you have to separate the fact that was deeply offensive to a number of people from the fact that, of course, you should not kill people who are doing a satirical magazine. It should be noted, I think, and I think the question is a good one. If it were anti-Semitic, if it were racist, would we be as supportive? I think because we're pretty ignorant of what is offensive to Muslims in this country, it might not play that way. But I think it should be noted that the New York Times did not print this imagery, and they were under a lot of criticism. People said, if you stand with Charlie Hebdo, you should print this. And the editor of the Washington Post said, they printed something on an editorial page. They didn't print it, and they said, and they took a lot of heat for it, we don't print things that are deeply offensive to religious groups. And so people didn't stand with, journalistic organizations made their own call on this. So I think that does speak to the fact that people were sensitive to whether this was deeply offensive.
Dr. Younus, how do you feel? I want to hear from Dr. Younus first, and then I'll get to you guys.
I think this question is at the heart of the debate, because as Ahmadiyya Muslim community, we've never asked for restrictions of speech. We are denouncing blasphemy laws. When we say that you accommodate the sanctity of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal treatment. We're not asking for penal code. We're asking for a social code. My call is not to the American courts. My call is to the American conscience, because American conscience will not use an N-word, even though First Amendment will not be crushed by that. We will not go and do an anti-Semitic cartoon, or we will not mock Holocaust, or we will not make homophobic jokes. We don't want that, because that makes us a better society. All we are saying is that the sanctity of the Prophet be entered into that red line. So we be given that equal treatment, not any special treatment.
Cliff, I want to ask you a question. The First Amendment gives us freedom of speech, but is it morally right, in your opinion?
People can object to morals. If people had gone to Charlie Hebdo and protested peacefully outside, there'd be no controversy. We have to understand there's a difference between protesting, writing editorials, being angry, and taking guns and going in and gunning down and slaughtering the entire editorial staff of Charlie Hebdo. That is the problem. Free speech means nothing if it doesn't include the speech, the freedom to offend, and it will. There are anti-Semitic cartoons all the time in the Middle East. There are anti-Christian artworks that get government support right here in this country. People are offended, and they take it because they know that's the price of freedom of speech. This all goes, it's great we're having this conversation now.
Sure.
We could have been having it a quarter a century ago.
Robert Mapplethorpe comes to mind.
Well, that's now comes to mind for me, but you're right. But Robert Mapplethorpe was certainly offensive, but no one went and killed a lot of people as a result of it. But recall that the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of the Islamic Revolution in Iran of 1979, in 1989, saw a book by a Muslim, Salman Rushdie, and he found it offensive.
Satanic verses.
The Satanic verses. He said, this is offensive. And so Salman Rushdie, who was not a citizen of his country, a British subject living in Europe, he said, this man, this author, he must be murdered. He must be killed. And any translators must be killed. And they must be done so by any believing Muslim who hears my fatwa today. That's what he said, and people were killed over his book. He was trying to enforce his reading of Sharia, of blasphemy, not just in his country but in Europe. Now, what the Europeans should have done is they should have sent every Iranian diplomat home. They should have said no more Iranian aircraft can fly here until you understand that you cannot restrict freedom in our country. They didn't. They said, poor Salman Rushdie, he better get a bodyguard, and he better be careful because he's in trouble. That was the beginning of the erosion of free speech in America.
The trouble is that what this really is just a part of a larger program. And I think, again, like focusing narrowly on ISIL, if you do that, you miss what is afoot here. Sharia blasphemy is part and parcel of an effort to force everyone to submit to the larger program. It's not an isolated thing that they just are worried about defending
Muslims' sense of the propriety of that process.
If you don't mind,
it's a larger program.
If you don't mind, I'd like to send this to Congressman Perry from Pennsylvania. I'm sure you've been listening into this conversation, sir. What's your take on this?
Well, I have been listening, and I don't want to talk over anybody, but it seems to me that the difference has already been outlined. There have been morally reprehensible publications regarding Christianity, regarding Judaism, you name it, in the United States and around the free world. But the difference is that while people find that objectionable, we don't create laws against it, and it's more of a societal code where we determine that that's objectionable, and we use the mores of society to cast that aside and say we don't want to see anything like that. The difference is under the Sharia motivated situation, you kill people, and not only the people that were involved in the editorial cartooning, but the guard that had the police officer outside had absolutely nothing to do with it. He gets killed too. And I think that is the reason for the outrage.
Who was a Muslim? All right, we have another question from our audience.
Yeah, right. I mean, who has more to lose than the poor apostate?
I'm sorry. Sorry to cut you off, Congressman. What is your name?
Good evening. My name is Nick Page.
All right, Nick, and what is your question?
Just wondering, given the discussion tonight, is democracy compatible with Islam and Sharia law, as we were just discussing? Should that be our policy in the Middle East, to go for democracies?
Well, of course, democracy, the Holy Quran lays out no rule. It does not say that you cannot have democracy. And the Charter of Medina, once again, I love Google. Just go Google the term. Charter of Medina predated Magna Carta by nearly 600 years. So that is the first democratic constitution created by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself. That is what we are trying to do here. That this is the narrative of real Islam. And if you go to real Islam, in Quran it is mentioned that you need to do consultation, and those things are democratic principles. Let me stipulate a few things here so we can move the conversation forward. One second.
Nobody's this is dominating the conversation.
Otherwise,
could you allow others to speak too, please?
Sure, sir.
This is really an important question. You need to understand how Sharia is practiced, not just by a certain subset of the larger population, but by the people who actually enshrine it in their states. Look at Iran. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at the Taliban, Afghanistan.
How about
there
Turkey,
is no
though?
question that democracy is not operating in any of those countries, nor could it.
How about
nor
Turkey or Tunisia, though? How about Turkey and Tunisia?
Can I just make a slightly different...
I think you're watching Turkey transformed into something that is not democratic.
Yeah, can I just make a different point about the, well, first of all, about the media, but also about the woman who asked the question. If people are signing up for ISIS, why are they signing up for ISIS? The U.S. government has, I think there's a very interesting media question about what should we show, because they have been extraordinarily effective at scaring the world with these terrible events that they have done. But I just want to go back to what this woman said here. If moderates feel in this country that we are linking Muslim and terrorists, and we're talking about Sharia law, and they don't feel that that's who they are, then we're not winning their hearts and minds.
That's precisely my point.
And we need to make clear that if they are not with this program, they are not the problem.
We have Congressman Perry chomping at the bit to weigh in on this conversation. Congressman, sir.
Well, it seems great to have a conversation about what you hope or what you think or what you personally wish that Sharia was, but most of the world right now is watching the reality of what it is to them. And what it is to them is children being buried alive, people being burned alive, people having their heads cut off, and people of a different religion than that when intolerantly being forced out of their countries or forced to submit to death. So while I appreciate what we wish things were, what they are in actuality is what I think we really need to be focusing on, and I think it kind of proves that Sharia and modernity or Western civilization, Western democracy don't really work very well together. As a matter of fact, they seem completely incongruent.
All right, Congressman, before we get back to our panel, let's check back now with our chief political reporter, Scott Thuman, who is monitoring this conversation on social media, getting quite lively up here, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And I want to talk about something else, because we've been discussing the fact that there are freedoms that are affected by this war on terror. And really one that we need to touch on is the freedom to travel without fear. Now, really since 9/11, that has been ebbing. We know that. But there is a new concern for airlines in the amount of threats, bomb threats, via Twitter. For flyers these days, a new headache, not just delays, but online threats. Dozens of them.
It concerns me a lot, especially with everything that's going on today. You know, that really concerns me. I hope they find out who's doing that.
Copycats. I'm worried that, somebody's going to say, oh, let's jump on the bandwagon and have a real threat.
A recent spike in sinister tweets with claims of bombs on board and coming from accounts that at first glance may appear ISIL-related have meant emergency landings, evacuations, even scrambled fighter jets.
We are concerned about terrorist organizations' new, slick, and skilled use of the Internet.
While Homeland Security says none have been legitimate, all must be taken seriously. The FBI is tracking IP addresses and making arrests in hopes of deterring copycats. But the hoaxes cost more than dollars, possibly millions each time. They also add to our fears, and some say to the terror ISIL is hoping to spread. And on top of the fact that the airlines do have to respect these threats, because you can't ignore such a public display like that, we've actually seen in what you may think is a bit of a bizarre twist, the airlines engage with the tweets. For example, following one particular threat, Delta Assist actually said back to that person regarding the flight, where did you leave the bomb? I mean, that's the world in which we now live, where you may be flying, have a tweet that threatens your flight, and the airline responds back because the concerns are that legitimate. Jeff?
Scott, thank you very much as always. And it amazed me because watching the Super Bowl a few weeks ago, they actually had a commercial saying no drones allowed in the stadium. And I never thought we'd live in an age where we had to do that. And the State Department is now reconfiguring its danger list for American travelers traveling abroad. So times, they are, without a doubt, as Bob Dylan would say, changing. We have an audience member with a question, sir. What is your name?
Yes, sir. My name is Orlando Fox. And my question to the panelists may be quite different, but here's my voice. There are many Americans who feel in order to obliterate ISIS, we need to put boots on the ground. I don't necessarily espouse violence, but the reality is with the multilateral Arab supporters that we have, such as UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, my concern is, and my question is, should we put boots on the ground from some of our Arab partners, obliterate ISIS, particularly when we are seeing the violence of burning people alive and the beheading of others?
That's a very good question. And in addition to that, would there be a way of forming possibly a pan-Arab NATO? So anyone wants to chime in on that answer?
Well, I would say this. That's a tactical decision. You need the strategic decision first. And the strategic decision has to be to fight the larger war against what I would call jihadism. These people consider themselves to be fighting a jihad against the West. And that includes the Islamic State, it includes the Islamic Republic of Iran, it includes Al-Qaeda, it includes the Taliban, it includes Boko Haram, it includes Al-Shabaab, it includes dozens of different groups. You have to figure out a way to do all of this, and it is not easy. Now, there's no question that we want to have support from moderate Arab states, from our Arab allies. Jordan has its hands full probably protecting its borders. I was in Jordan twice over in the last year or so. They are doing a good job, but they have to protect themselves and their borders. It would be hard for them to have expeditionary forces going out beyond their borders. Not impossible. The Emiratis want to fight very much, but they also want the U.S. to be doing more than it's doing. They're afraid that if they should lose a plane, there will be no rescue of that plane because we have no rescue efforts, partly because the Turks are not allowing us to run those out of Turkey. So, yes, we should have as broad a coalition as we can. We should have input from as many Arab states as we can that want to fight jihadism, and there are some, but this is going to be difficult. And finding a strategy to fight the broader conflict of the 21st century, we've got a long way to go before we're there.
It really goes back to what the Congressman was saying, too, which is that this is a war against us. Contrary to what Susan Rice said the other day, I believe it is an existential war. It requires of us a use of all instruments of national power against it. Cliff's right that the tactical decisions about boots here or boots there is one thing, but bringing to bear economic power, bringing to bear our intelligence capabilities, bringing to bear, most importantly perhaps, a counter-ideological component. President Reagan had one back in the Cold War, and it was very effective in countering the Soviet Union. I believe that's what we need to adapt today.
All right, Congressman Scott Perry, what do you think should be happening here?
Well, let's just be clear here. Boots on the ground are actually people in those boots. So somebody, somebody's soul's going along with that. Now, of course, we've got a sour taste on our mouth after winning the stability and the peace in Iraq and having, in my opinion, the president give that all away. But at some point, anybody that knows anything about military tactics and strategy is that somebody's going to have to secure that terrain. It doesn't necessarily have to be American boots and and soldiers, but we hope it wouldn't be. But if it's going to be the Arab countries, some of them are going to have to change their calculation, because the very folks that are now threatened by this are the folks that have been creating this for 40 plus years now, and even longer, since the 1740s in the case of Saudi Arabia. So when they see their own livelihoods and vitality and very lives threatened, I imagine they'll get with the program. But they're happy to let somebody else do their bidding, and they'd be very happy to have America do it. I think it's our job to let them see the light, show them the light, and get them directly in the fight with their souls and with their country's vitality and well-being at stake. And so far, that hasn't happened.
All right, Congressman, let's take another question from viewers across the country. A lot of people interested in this topic.
My name is Rebecca Ruth. I'm living in Baltimore, Maryland, and my question is, how can we, as people and as researchers, as we're looking at terrorism, finding ways to approach it with an unbiased perspective so that we're not fanning the flames from either direction?
Just look at the facts. It comes down to the facts.
I would say just look at the overwhelming facts. We've had 20,000 foreign fighters go to Syria and Iraq over the term of this thing, and I think 5,000 in about the last 3 months. And you look at the ground that's been covered, the atrocities that have occurred, and you can certainly pinpoint them to one ideology. There are a few others that rival it, certainly at this time in history, and it should be fairly obvious to you, I would think. But if there's some specific question about do you think something's underreported or something is being sensationalized, I think it'd be great to hear that right now, because I'm not sure what it'd be.
Dr. Younus, I want to ask you a question that a woman said unbiased. Now, I don't know any time in the history of warfare when people have been unbiased or biased, actually, in fighting the enemy. Have you ever come across anything like that, or this is just a continuing fight since the dawn of man, is it not?
Well, there is a new instrument which is unbiased, and we call that the internet. I would suggest Rebecca should get online, stop watching TV, stop listening to radio.
Wherever you live. This TV station.
Of course. Well, I would say everything on the internet is not pure and factual either. I think people have to understand and recognize and come to grips with the fact that there is good and there is evil in the world, and because you're against evil doesn't mean you're biased. I mean, if you like evil, I guess that's good for you, but it's not good for most of free people who want to be secure and have the peace of mind of knowing they're not going to walk out their door and be attacked. So I think we have to come to that conclusion at some point.
You squarely asked me to answer the question, and that's why I wanted to chime in. My point really is there's a context to every story. We're talking about the what, when, where, how of the story, but nobody wants to talk about the why. There is a large context here. Who is funding these groups? Where is the supply chain? What is our relationship with Saudi Arabia? What happened in the aftermath of our war in Afghanistan? What happened, what created Taliban? That was the aftermath of our war in Afghanistan. I was there in Pakistan back then. What is ISIS? This is the aftermath of our Iraq war. Mm-hmm. There is actually another ISIS in the womb right now, and those are the 4 million Syrian refugees that nobody wants to talk about. What do you think those children are going to grow up to be? There is another ISIS in the pipeline. So forget about winning this war. Yeah. We are up against a very tall mountain. You bring up
a very good point with the Mujahideen during the Soviet.
But I don't think
turns on us.
We should be very key. Well, yes, we helped the Mujahideen in Afghanistan free themselves from the Soviets. We might have thought that freeing them from Soviet occupation would mean we would have won their friendship. No, they turned on us afterwards. We should not think that it is our actions that create this. Jihadism has been around a long time. Your community, your community is persecuted in Pakistan by a government that says it is an Islamic and Islamist, I would say, government, and your people are persecuted because your interpretation of Islam and of Sharia is different, and they are intolerant of it. Right. And that's not because Americans have been in Iraq
Iraq or Americans had helped in Afghanistan. It is something much more fundamental that kind of intolerance is in Pakistan, a place that was supposed to be a tolerant country and was when it was created under Mohammed Jameen.
And then funded by the Saudis.
Funded by the Saudis and the Iranians.
Sorry to tap you down. Just hold it just for a second. We have another audience member with a question. Thanks so much for your patience. What's your name?
Thank you very much. My name is Akili West.
And where are you from?
I'm from Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I am a Muslim and an American, and I probably don't fit the look that many people see when they think about Muslim. Nor does the imam at my mosque. He's a retired colonel from the U.S. military, served his country proudly and well for many years. My question is, to all the panelists, do you feel as though there's a double standard when it comes to Islam and terrorists? Because I remember Timothy McVeigh, the KKK, so many Christian fundamentalists, even who interpret Christian Christianity in different ways. There's some that beat themselves and beat others.
Right. So you're getting to another religion.
What I'm just saying is that is there a double standard when we view Islam and terrorism versus when we view, because obviously there's no monopoly. You look at Northern Ireland, there's terrorists all over the world, but when a Christian terrorist does something, they're labeled as a lone extremist usually.
All right,
because I think
Dr. Younus, what do you think?
Pretty clear.
Can I answer that?
If I may, as a non-Muslim, let me answer.
I thought my name was Dr. Younus.
Yours is, and I was hoping that I might be asked.
All right, Dr. Younus, you're next.
No big deal.
In this instance, I think it's fairly clear. We're looking at a pattern of behavior that unfortunately is not simply lone wolves. It is endorsed, it is derived from, it is expressly described as God's will in the Quran. Now, not all Muslims, again, and I think Dr. Younus is a prime example of it, and I hope this gentleman is, and I hope his imam is as well, are people who don't want any part of that. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. Christians who have completely deviated from Christ's teachings are considered by the Christian world to be terrorists and are treated as such. Terrorists who are practicing jihad are regarded by the authorities of their faith as people who are executing what they are supposed to do under Allah's will. That's a totally different deal, and I don't think it's a double standard.
Well, it is the times in which we live, Dr.
No, it's the fundamental.
Fanaticism is a monster that pretends to be the child of religion. That's what Voltaire said, and that is very true. There is fanaticism in every faith. Islam has a history of 1,400 years. You don't see beheading in those 1,350 years.
You certainly
This is
do.
an extreme. Let me finish, sir.
You certainly do.
You go ahead.
No,
I would love, because this is free speech. I would love that. Because again, my prophet did not do that. When Prophet Muhammad...
Your prophet most certainly did, sir. I don't know what you're reading of your prophet, but he certainly did. Read the hadith.
Let me tell you something.
Beheading was something he did with rather considerable effect.
I would really love to answer this. This is what my prophet did. He said that Jesus, peace be upon him, is mentioned 28 times in Holy Quran, is extremely dear to my heart. And imagine, right now, I would ask, and I would like to talk to the audience, imagine any mob in a Muslim country right now in your head, and you will never see that mob, no matter how angry they are, you will never see them burning an effigy of Jesus. That is what my prophet is, sir. And try to get to know him, because this is precisely what is driving hundreds of American and European Muslims to ISIS. This kind of language is alien.
But your prophet will burn a Muslim pilot because he is not obedient to them.
Well,
look, here's the context to that. Let me try to put this in a simple.
You go ahead and
put this in a simple way. No one would say that the Inquisition did not come out of Christianity. Of course it did. Very few Christians I know would say, I justify that, or that had nothing to do with Christianity. Of course it did. Now we have, right now, some very pathological, very dangerous ideologies that have bubbled up from the Islamic world.
I agree with that.
I know you do. Yeah. And am I suggesting that most Muslims endorse that? Of course they don't. But it is important to understand the Islamic State, that you cannot say it has nothing to do with Islam. Al-Qaeda, you cannot say that bin Laden had nothing to do with Islam. This comes out of their interpretation
of their theology.
I agree with you, but let me just make a very quick point.
Wait, Clifford, I'm sorry. I have to cut you off once again. Please, let me send it back to Scott Thuman, our political reporter, who is monitoring this conversation on social media from our newsroom, because I have a feeling the country, or the people at least watching this program, are as passionate as our panel has been tonight. Scott.
There are, and one of the things we're talking about, Jeff, is indeed that execution video, which you were just referencing there on the panel, and we know that ISIL is media savvy. We've seen that in the past, but I believe what we saw in that particular video was a true escalation of that. Now, we're obviously not going to show you the actual execution, but we do want to point out that in this video, there was about 20 minutes preceding it, and during the video, we saw what we might qualify as perhaps movie theater quality production value. In laying out its case against the Western belief, ISIL has now clearly created a media team with a truly impressive combination of the editing, the photography. The point is here, Jeff, this is no longer bin Laden in a cave. Those very basic elementary videos. These videos are meant to impress, to be a pitch, to sell, and to most importantly recruit. And it is easy to see the importance that ISIL is assigning to this part of the war. And I would argue, as we discussed this earlier today, Jeff, when I went to Iraq in a freelance capacity, I was freelance reporting in the fall of 2003 and went there. Just prior to that, Nicholas Berg had been beheaded. Obviously, that was on my mind, as well as other journalists who were doing the same thing I was. We were terrified of that prospect, but not to the degree with which we are seeing now. And it's because this particular group is so media savvy, does put out these videos that take such pride in it, that show another level of reason to be scared, that it is a deterrent for a lot of journalists in wanting to go over there and tell the story. So the media production value of what we are seeing today is an important aspect of this war on terror. And once again, as we go circling back to the idea of freedoms that are affected by this war, we are seeing another freedom affected.
Can I just make one point about their propaganda?
You know what's very interesting? Just a second. We'd like to hear from Congressman Perry from Pennsylvania. It seems as though, Congressman, that they have gotten very media savvy, as you just heard Scott Thuman say, over the past few years. It almost makes you wonder whether some journalists have joined this organization. What say you?
Well, I think they probably have. I think all professions have joined the organization, and I think it's interesting to note that they're not only asking fighters to come from around the world to where the fight is in Syria and Iraq, but to do it in your own home, which goes to the previous caller, Mr. West's question, is there some kind of unfair treatment? I don't recall any Americans dancing in the street when Timothy McVeigh bombed the federal building in Oklahoma, but I do recall certain adherents to Sharia around the world dancing and cheering when the World Trade Center went down. So I think that terrorism is derided by all Americans, whether it's conducted under the guise of Catholicism or whether you're just having a bad day and you're a lone wolf. But there's a very different dynamic here. That this is orchestrated. There's a plan here. There's a greater plan, and it doesn't just include the Middle East. It includes every single neighborhood and town across the globe.
Jane, this is something that intrigued me immensely, was the fact that the president at a prayer breakfast was saying that early Christianity went through the Spanish Inquisition. It also basically went through the Crusades. That's all well and good, but we've had enemies in the past in the 20th century like Germany, Japan, over 200 years ago, Great Britain. Now they're among our greatest allies. He's going back 1,000 years. What's the difference?
Well, I think from what I've read that he was trying to make a point and reach out to people of other faiths and say that Christianity had been responsible for evil. I think that
did he make the point?
I'm not sure that given the criticism of it, I don't know. But I just read a story about how people in the Muslim community were happy that he did that, and yet not happy that he's having a conference with Muslim leaders and then the next day having a conference about terrorism. I do think we need to, I would just like to make two media points.
Sure.
I think the U.S. government had better figure out how to counter the appeal. We keep showing these videos over and over, admiringly, frankly, how savvy they are. We better figure out why disaffected young people in this country tried to sign up. Young women are trying to sign up. We have to counter this propaganda. And, they have to do with our policies. I'm not an expert on our policies, but But I really think, that this is a very serious problem, and we keep showing these things. I mean, I totally disagree with Fox News showing that complete video.
But you have to start by identifying the problem. I mean, we're sort of dancing around it. We have a disagreement as to whether it has anything to do with the teachings and the practice of Islam as defined by the authorities. And just one very interesting data point. President al-Sisi of Egypt, who called for, I think, something very similar to what you're talking about, a revolution within his faith in order to get away from these kinds of practices, didn't call out the Islamic State. He didn't call out Al-Qaeda. He didn't call out the Taliban. He didn't call out Boko Haram. And he went to Al-Azhar University, what some call the Vatican of Islam, and he spoke directly to the leading imams of the faith and said, you have to stop this. That's a very important message. It's likely to get him killed. There's a Muslim Brotherhood edict for his assassination, and this has everything to do with that underlying reality. You're absolutely right, Jane. We have to get our hands around it, but it has to be fact-based and reality-based.
And Jane, you bring up a good point about Fox News showing it. CNN decided not to show it. Fox showed it because they wanted to show the brutality. CNN didn't want to show it because they didn't want to give ISIS any more publicity than they've already gotten. So, tough call journalistically. Speaking of journalism,
tough call, but both good points. But I think the president at the prayer breakfast bringing up the Crusades of 1,000 years ago only helps to embolden our enemy and to give some kind of justification to the cause. I find it unbelievable that he would make some moral equivalency to what happened 1,000 years ago and what's occurring right now in the 21st century. I almost couldn't believe it. I was embarrassed and disgusted at it, quite frankly.
It's amazing because a lot of people question the venue in which he brought that message across. We have a journalistic student being with us tonight, and where are you from? American University?
American University.
All right, what's your name, sir?
Trey Inc.
Trey Inc. And where are you from?
Originally from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Ah, okay. And what question do you have?
My question for the panel is with all of this discussion tonight, it seems like it's very clear people disagree on what's going on in the world today. So how can journalism be used as a tool to foster positive conversation, particularly from hot zones where, as we discussed earlier, it can be difficult to get an objective story out?
If a country lets a journalist go to those so-called hot zones. Jane, that sounds like a question for you.
Okay, well, I think we have an increasing difficulty, as we've discussed. News organizations are spending a great deal of money to have people in some of these hot spots because of the tremendous danger. And Syria, the civil war in Syria is the most dangerous place to be in the world. So I guess what I would say to Trey's question is I would turn it almost around and say, what can we be doing in this country to try to be helpful in terms of understanding some of these communities that we don't hear from? I do think that most Americans think that Muslim and terrorist are the adjective and the noun because there's such extraordinary ignorance. And there's a lot of incendiary talk around that. So I think we need to get into these countries. We need to report what you all are saying. We need to not dance around it, which is what you all are saying. I think we do dance around it. But at the same time, we have people whose voices are never heard in this country, who do represent moderate voices, who don't look like what we think. And I think we have a terrible stereotype. I mean, if you ask most Americans, they have a stereotype of what a Muslim looks like. I mean, I'm sure if people were honest, they do.
But listen, one of the folks that I think need to hold accountable for this is the President of the United States, who is rewarding and legitimating and emboldening and empowering a part of this Muslim community that I suspect doesn't speak for you. Certainly, I hope doesn't speak for the vast majority of American Muslims and probably Muslims around the world, and that is the Muslim Brotherhood and its front organizations that include the Council on American Islamic Relations. Good thing they're not here tonight. The point is, those shouldn't be held up as the leaders of the Muslim community. We need to empower people like you and your community. We need to be trying to push back against those who are trying to persecute you.
But that starts with being realistic and honest about the people who are on the other side, including the Brotherhood.
So sorry to cut you off, but we are running out of time, and we can talk about this for hours. There's no doubt about it. Let's go back one more time to Chief Political Reporter Scott Thuman, who is monitoring this conversation on social media from our newsroom. Scott.
Something else that spurs plenty of debate here, Jeff. This particular tweet, and that's something that I just want to throw back to the panel here. It's from Nigel, who says, using our hashtag, Your Voice, Your Future, we shouldn't be putting our boots on the ground. The Middle East nations should have their boots on the ground in their region. Obviously, they do to some degree, but there is a greater overall push for more emphasis on that particular effort by Middle East nations. Back to you guys.
All right, Scott, thanks so much. We have 2.5 minutes left in the show. We have one more question from our audience member. Hi, sir.
Hi, my name is Amjad Mahmood Khan, and I teach law at UCLA, American Muslim. My question is that Pope Francis came out very strongly recently against insults to religious personages, and he'll be addressing a joint session of Congress later this year. And I'm deeply curious to ask Mr. Gaffney and the Congressman whether they disagree with Pope Francis.
And Mr. Gaffney and the Congressman have about 30 seconds apiece. Go ahead.
I believe that.
All right, I'll go first. I agree that it's morally reprehensible. However, it is still allowed under free speech and under our Constitution. And once we start down the road of taking that away, because I find it, and you might find it objectionable, Katie barred the door, everything else is next. But I'll let Frank fill in the rest of the narrative.
I would just say amen, and that we have a responsibility to use our own judgment about whether or not we wish to give offense, but we are entitled to give offense if we do wish to do so.
Jane, we have a little bit more time. What do you think? Last thoughts.
Well, freedom of speech and the First Amendment are actually about the marketplace of ideas, and I think that we should cherish that, and we should try to have a civilized and valid conversation about these issues. We really do need to.
All right, Cliff.
Our marketplace of ideas is endangered right now, and we need to protect it.
It's one thing to hustle in the marketplace of ideas, but it's totally another when your beloved is singled out while everybody else gets their special treatment, and you are constantly denied access into those
lives.
There's no resemblance to reality.
We want to thank you so very, very much. And please, audience members with great, great questions, can you please give this esteemed panel a big round of applause for being here with us to give us a different perspective on a very, very sensitive topic. But we certainly appreciate you coming in. The questions from the panel, if you don't mind giving them applause, because they had some great questions tonight, without a doubt. These town hall meetings obviously are going to continue, so thank you so much for being with us, everybody here in the audience and also in the panel for the town hall. Your voice, your future, fight for freedom. That will do it for us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's town hall. I'm Jeff Barn. Have a great night, everybody.